Hallelujah. The believer's journey in this kingdom is likened to the journey of the nation of Israel from Egypt. There were two phases to that journey. Number one was coming out of Egypt. So the first dimension of that journey was a focus on deliverance, to be free from Pharaoh and to be free from the oppression of the Egyptians. Then the second dimension of the journey was the focus of entering into the promised land. Are we together? They didn't start with the focus of entering into the promised land. Their initial desire was to come out of this place of oppression. They had been oppressed for 430 years, and their desire was to by all means get out of Egypt. And when they got out of Egypt, there were two processes to that deliverance. Number one was the initial exodus, and then number two, the drowning of Pharaoh and his horsemen to give them total freedom from the influence of the Egyptians. All of that entire journey explains how a believer grows until he comes into the fullness of his inheritance. Everybody by default starts as a slave in Egypt, a slave to Satan, sin, Satan, hell, curses, darkness, everything you can find in Egypt. And then a word of deliverance comes likened to your salvation. And then that initial exodus, a translation, you literally leave that place. There is a translocation, even though this happens in the spirit. But because you have left Egypt does not mean Pharaoh will leave you. Are we together? So Pharaoh saddled his horses and the riders, and they began to pursue them. And then the nation of Israel came to the Red Sea in front of them, the Egyptians behind them. And then the water had to part hither and thither, and they passed through it on dry ground. And then the water drowned the nation of Egypt together with Pharaoh. And that was the end of it, but not the end of the journey. From the time Pharaoh and Egypt were dealt with, the next port of call was no longer threat from Egypt. Are we together? It was accuracy of perception so that they will arrive the promised land. Do you know what Pharaoh could not do, what the chariots could not do? Their carelessness of perception did to them. What swords could not do, what a trained army could not do. A trained army could not stop their advancement, but something within themselves stopped them from entering the promised land. That means in this business of transition, until you become the full portrait of the believer, it is not all about Satan and curses and sin. All those can be dealt with, and yet you will be surprised that you will never grow to step into the fullness of your inheritance. Because the problem of Israel was not Pharaoh alone. It started with Pharaoh, it started with Egypt, but there was more. They forgot that they were also part of their problems, because when Pharaoh had gone and when Egypt had gone, they were still not free. By themselves, they began to put pressure upon Aaron and say, build us a golden calf. They were not pressured by Pharaoh, they were not pressured by Egypt. On their own accord, Moses goes up the mountain to meet with God and to receive commandment for them. And Moses is on his way back, and he hears the voice of merriment, and he said, what is going on here? And he comes into the camp and sees that the gold, the treasure that they left with, that was supposed to be for the building of the tabernacle and for their own prosperity, they converted it and they served Satan. They built a golden calf and began to dance around it. Can you imagine how distracted they could be? That a people who left with a very clear vision to take you out of Egypt into a land flowing with milk and honey so that you will serve the Lord. The mandates that advocated the deliverance was very clear. Let my people go, that they may go and serve me. That means until you have that full liberty, the journey is not ended. But the people distracted themselves by themselves. There was no record that someone came outside of the camp to influence their decision.